Hi, everybody. I'm Judy Tate. I am the founding artistic director of Stargate Theater. Stargate Theater is MTC's theater company within a theater company. And every year in the summer, we employ a group of young men impacted by the justice system to create and perform an original play on one of Manhattan Theater Club's stages. And I am so excited, absolutely delighted to be joined today by one of the co-founders of Stargate Theater, Evan Elkin. Evan is currently the executive director of Reclaiming Futures, a national public health-oriented juvenile justice reform organization dedicated to improving behavioral health outcomes for young people and families. Hi, Evan.
Hey, Judy. Thanks so
How
much
are
for inviting me.
you?
It's really great to see you.
It's great to see you too. I mean, you've moved across the United States, and so we don't get to hang out except in two dimensions.
I know. Thanks to Zoom, we can hang out again.
I know, it's wonderful. Um, because you have so much expertise in this area, I was wondering if you could give us a sort of overview of the juvenile justice system. What are the types of programs that exist, things like that.
Sure. I'll give you a little bit of history because I think one of the things about the juvenile justice system is that it's an evolving story, and there have been some key moments in time. I think the formation of what we now know as family court. I don't know how many decades ago, there was an affirmative recognition and a decision that young people, that children needed to be handled when they run afoul of the law in a different setting other than the adult court system. And so I think drawing from some of the existing institutions in the child welfare system, a
Mm.
lot of places that and you guys are in New York, where a lot of these old institutions exist, places that used to be orphanages that have now become these large residential child welfare congregate care settings where child welfare kids are placed, but also became the first settings where if a young person needed to be placed somewhere for their own safety or whatever the decisions, we can get into those decisions were always kind of tricky when someone like a judge decides that you as a child need to go live somewhere else and not in your own community. So the formation of family court was the very first recognition that children, at least from the standpoint of the court, are different than adults. And a number of other things have happened over time. Something called the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, which I think was first, this is going to be public and I'm going to be wrong, but I believe it was first enacted in the 70s. It's been re-upped a number of times. It recently got re-upped again after quite a bit of debate. And that was a federal set of laws that kind of put more into law some of those protections that the Family Court Act early on. So things about protecting minors from certain kinds of treatment, certain conditions of confinement if you had to use jail and detention, standards of practice. And so there are federal standards that dictate. And so over time, one of the things that have happened, and I think one of the things that really led to the creation and the reason why something like Stargate can exist, is that the field of juvenile justice has increasingly become interested in partnering in the community with organizations and with kinds of activities and experiences as an alternative to what you would normally think of as like a court experience. You get arrested, you go to court, you get sentenced. If you're sentenced, you're either on probation or parole, or you go to jail or prison. In juvenile justice, there has been a flourishing in the last really 20, 25 years of a set of alternative kinds of outcomes if a kid gets arrested. You can get diverted by the police right away. Police have a lot of discretion at the point of arrest to issue certain kinds of tickets, appearance tickets. So a parent and a kid just need to show up, and sometimes it's the first time something like that happens to you, it's really just an insignificant and bureaucratic event in your life. You have to show up and go through, sometimes sit with a group and watch a video or something like that. That's this, one kind of alternative program in the hands of police and in probation. And then one of the biggest things that's happened that's kind of relevant to my career is that a lot of treatment-oriented alternative programs have emerged over time. There was a recognition, a couple of decades ago, and looking at the data on who is coming into the system, the kids are arriving having not received treatment in the past, but showing a lot of symptoms of needing support. And we can debate, that's an interesting point of debate, is really how much services and therapy kids need, and whether services and therapy have come to kind of stand in for the other kinds of control that we typically did in the past of kids. That mandating somebody to get help and punishing them if they don't get help is really just a sort of a replacement kind of way of having custody of somebody. But generally, these are very positive things, that someone who breaks the law, gets arrested, is offered a chance to do some counseling. And then other kinds of alternative programs are the Stargate-like programs, youth development programs.
That's what I was going to say.
Oh, cool.
A lot of our young men have been referred to us out of diversion programs, and I think it's wonderful. Also, we have noticed over the years that there are fewer really young people being sent into these into jail programs, and it's great. We have to look harder for young men, and I think that's success, right?
Oh yeah, no, it's really an interesting phenomenon that's happened over time. And it's funny to say, the programs that operate in the courts need to look harder to suck kids into their programs, which is a kind of a tricky thing, because you don't want to widen the net. You want to consider that this is a success, a societal success, if fewer kids are coming into the system, and think differently about what kinds of programs you could offer them, or to rethink what your program is. And the public health lens is really useful in that regard, because you think in terms of what are the things in community that are the sort of nourishing and healthful things that kids can get involved with that prevent them from getting in trouble to begin with. So, in a society where not a lot of kids get pushed into the justice system, programs like Stargate really become just what they are intended to be, which is a healthful, preventive youth development program. It doesn't need to be an alternative to anything.
Yeah, everybody's theater is everybody's birthright. Exactly. And it's not available as much to the kids in the communities that we serve, but it should be, and we're happy to be able to do that. I've noticed that the drug use from the kids that we get from the beginning until now has decreased, which means that there must be more social service in terms of self-medication, because that trauma care. A lot of kids that we first saw in Stargate were self-medicating because of trauma. And now we get kids who have already gone through some sort of care around that. Evan, can you talk a little bit about what the leading factors are in becoming involved in the juvenile justice system, so people out there know?
Sure. Well, I think you kind of hit on one of them. And I think that we are now, as you're pointing out, beginning to bear the fruits of our labors as reformers in the system, that we've built these programs. We've raised consciousness about trauma as an important experiential factor in the lives of the young people we serve. We've acknowledged it, begun to address it, crafted programs which really make us more human and more sensitive. We've acknowledged the need for treatment, and we've recognized that the kinds of things, in answer to your question, that are missing in communities sometimes can be a driver where the system becomes the kind of the treatment or the mentor or the custody or the care of last resort in a community that has been kind of, sort of vanquished of its resources. And we know that in American society, we've divested from certain communities. We have our food deserts, we have big neighborhoods that don't have a clinic that families can walk into. And so one of the answers to your question is that the divestment from communities of resources that care for kids and do the prevention we talked about earlier is what leads, society to lean more heavily on systems like juvenile justice and child welfare to do that work. Mm-hmm. And it's not a bad thing if someone arrives somewhere and gets treatment, but it really shouldn't be that way. We shouldn't operate a public health system for poor people and for people of color, operate a public health system that is embedded in the justice system, because that's just how the pathway has been built. You should be able to access your prevention and your opportunity and your theater programs and all of your mentoring naturally in your community. So I think some of it has to do with the fact that we have succeeded in raising consciousness about that message, and I think communities have more stuff to, and courts. I know judges we work with are trusting communities more to take the kid and take the story from here, as opposed to saying, I've really got to do this because there's nothing for you in the community. I don't trust the community. I don't trust your mom. More judges are willing to say, you belong in your community, so let's support you getting into some programs in the community, and I'll stay out of your hair. So there's some very innovative judges doing that. There's also some really fascinating trends that criminologists talk about, and I'm not a criminologist. The crime rates have just gone down over the last 20 years. There's been a steady decline in crime. So fewer people are committing crimes. And I think another one of those things that, we chalk up as a success, us folks who professionally consider ourselves reformers and advocates, is that police are not arresting kids as much for kids stuff, that we've managed to get this message across about adolescence being a time of stupid mistakes and knucklehead behavior, and to not just arrest our way out of adolescence.
I don't know. Did you ever do knucklehead behavior, Evan?
I will not confirm nor deny that I may have stolen a Greyhound bus when I was 17.
But you didn't go to jail and be put in solitary confinement for that?
I did not, because I came from a white family in a white, well-to-do suburban community. And when the police arrived at my door, they said, I'm sorry, Mr. Elkin, for bothering you.
Wow. That's interesting. I don't think any of our guys have experienced that.
No, I don't think so.
Because I don't, people know our company and some people don't who'll be tuning into this. And our company is predominantly Black and brown young men. And we have had the occasional white young man come in for typically a drug arrest or something. And when they describe their arrests, if they, we don't ask them, but sometimes they're talking about it. It's a very different story, usually. It's a very, very different story.
I know it is. And I would say, just in case the statute of limitations is longer than I think, I borrowed the bus.
You borrowed the
with
bus.
a group of my friends. We borrowed it, drove it about 5 miles, and then gave it back.
Well, some people say boys will be boys. I wanted to ask you too if this is changing. 5 years ago, we made a documentary that you were in. Well, we didn't make it, actually. PBS made it. And if you go to the Manhattan Theater Club website, you can find a link to it. It was called A Defining Act. And you had talked about zip code analysis showing poverty, lack of economic opportunity, heavy policing, being one of the, things you could go to see where we were going to get guys, right? Does that overlay still exist?
Yeah, I think it does. And again, I just want to say that these, poverty and geography and opportunity are not necessarily, in an individual kid's life causal of crime or causal of system involvement. But there are still really strong correlational studies you look to where the zip codes are that deliver the most kids to the child welfare system, that deliver the most families to family court, and adults to the criminal justice system, they tend to be predictable zip codes. And the reasons for that do have to do with opportunity, but also the nature of policing and where policing happens. And there have even been day of week and time of day analyses that are predictive of how many kids and which kids will get arrested. And when police conduct sweeps, that's when kids get arrested. So it's important to look at these structural factors. It's good policy information, but you need to be careful and not, people will take this information and think, oh, poor people from neighborhoods of color are much more likely to be criminals. And so I think that it's important to think of the data really in terms of what it says about society and how how we police and how we've pushed people of color into certain geographical areas.
Yeah, that's really important. I think that's really, really good to note, because there's still, surprisingly to me, there's still a lot of misconception around that. Let me put it that way.
And there is a lot of implicit bias.
Yeah. You know what? I want to get a little nerdy with you. Okay. The manager of our program, Wade Handy, who never likes to have his name mentioned or his face shown, but we went down to Florida to something that your organization was sponsoring, and we did a really fascinating, it wasn't a workshop, but we went to a talk by a woman who was talking about brain science. And so could you talk a little bit about, brain development and how that has impacted juvenile justice policy? And then I'll talk to you about what Stargate did about that.
Okay, yeah, cool. Yeah, so it's really interesting. First, I'm going to start with kind of a meta response to your question, which is that the fact that we have allowed the field to appreciate an understanding of what adolescent development means from a neurological and brain science perspective is an example of a number of ways that we've humanized the system, that we've given a very data and evidence-oriented system that really wants to see proof of things, and that's a good thing. There's been a trend in the last 15, 20 years around programs that people really want to see what is the science behind something, a program or an assertion or anything. And so having the brain scientists kind of dive into this question, which is how is the adolescent brain different and how does that impact behavior? And how does that impact how we should construct programs and juvenile justice interventions has really allowed for an advance in the field in terms of humanizing the field in a way. The biggest example is around life sentences, the use of solitary confinement, and the death penalty for young people. I think that's probably the most obvious and biggest impact of putting in the minds of prosecutors and judges and society that kids make mistakes by design, that the brain is wired, the young brain is designed, and in fact, needs to make mistakes in order to grow and develop. It needs
right.
To
they need to push boundaries right, and so they don't have as strong a sense of consequence yet.
Certainly, one of the things that gets talked about is the inability to project consequence, to project, to have the empathy to know how your actions are going to impact another person emotionally. But the idea is that these things accrue through experience, not necessarily. I think some things develop passively. By the time you get to 26, I think they say is the magic age where your brain is fully developed. But some of these things are in place just biologically, but not without experience. You need to still go through this trial and error thing that we call life in adolescence. And so that's one of the real kind of confounding things about juvenile justice is that we react to adolescent behavior by depriving kids of the opportunity and the right to make mistakes. Yeah. And we tend to remove them from context human development and brain development happens in relationship context to your peers, to your community, to people who will give you a break and give you 3 or 4 strikes before you're out. And if you build a system that only gives 1 strike, has 0 tolerance, that confines kids and takes them out of society, you're depriving that kid of the ability to develop into a good adult.
Well, that's really, really interesting. We took that science into account on 2 levels. A couple of years ago, we started doing that. One thing we started doing, rather than punitive measures for, lateness and not showing up, all those kinds of things that, have to become habits in a young person, we started putting in incentives for getting back to the circle on time. If everybody got back to the circle on time, because of course, working together, young men are really driven by their team, their crew, their friends. So if everybody could get back to the circle, then they would all get a $5 bonus for that day. If you showed up, every day on time for a week, you'd get a bonus at the end of that week. And that seemed to really speak to them. And the other thing that we did, so we put that into our program design, and it was really cool. But the other thing we did, we put it into our art as well. We talked to them a lot about brain development, and we showed them a lot of videos about who they were in this period of time. Because in their writing, one of the things that we could see was, I don't understand why I do the things I do. I don't understand why I did X, Y, and Z, right? Mm-hmm. And we would show these videos, and they would learn, oh, I'm not this horrible person because I got in a Greyhound bus and took it for a joyride, right?
Right.
And a couple of guys actually wrote, and they were like, oh, if I knew about this brain science, I would have never gotten in trouble.
So interesting. I know we don't often think of sharing information, the information we have that helps us to understand adolescents, with the adolescents themselves. They can actually make really good use of this if you present it in a way that's not pejorative or condescending. This is just good to know about your body. The same way we teach people about their reproductive health, we should teach kids about their brain.
About their brain, yes. And we ended up creating a show because we got interested after learning that. We got interested, well, what are the other stages of development and what happens in those stages? And that's the year we created 5 hoods. Mm-hmm. And it went all the way from babyhood to oldhood.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. And we had, the guys in white coats at every stage in life come out and talk about what was going on in each stage of development. So they really internalized all of that. So that was very exciting.
I know that Stargate does a beautiful job of leveraging community and team in the same way, like if you've ever been in a play, as many people watching this will, and I have, and obviously you've been in a million, is that the feeling you get of forming and becoming part of a group really is emblematic of what it means to kind of enter society as a young adult. And so just intrinsically what you're doing, even though, all the external rewards that they get, the $5, the praise and all of that, those things quickly transition to become intrinsic rewards because of what happens in the theater experience. Not only does it mimic real life, it is real life for them. And so, you don't need to control them, but I wonder, would you stop showing up for work if your paycheck stopped?
Well, you know what? They have actually said, I think I'd do this even if I wasn't being
right. That's when you win. Yeah.
Yeah, because when they stand there and they have worked so hard over several weeks and they hear that applause and they take that bow, there's no high like it. you
right.
know?
Right. And as we've talked about before, my dad is 88 and he still thrives on the applause. He's an actor and a director. Yeah. So I don't think that goes away. That's
funny. When we first met, Evan, your your family is full of theater people, right?
Mhm.
And my family, my sister is a psychologist. You're a psychologist. There's so
So we're both
we
black
sort
sheeps in different kinds of families.
of right. Absolutely. So basically you can say that programs like Stargate fit into sort of like the positive youth development ecosystem well, or
Absolutely, and I think one of the most encouraging trends in the programs like Stargate are increasingly trusted in their own right to have the kind of impact that they have for young people in the community, whether you're in trouble or not. And I know we've talked about this before, that when a program like a theater program, which you described as a birthright, and I believe that philosophy, is then held as something that is a kid's last chance to demonstrate their goodness to a judge. And if they show their adolescent, vulnerability and screw it up, why should a theater program be held to the level of accountability, for this kid's behavior? And I think that the perception has been softened. People are beginning to understand that we should just trust programs like Stargate to do what they do for all kids of all skin colors, whether you're in trouble or not, which is to plant a seed in a person's life. Not every kid in Stargate is going to become an actor or a playwright or a director. Some will, but all of them will take that experience, like the 5 really cool things I did at that age, that are not directly part of my professional life. Like, no one was holding a program, a summer camp or my guitar teacher accountable for my behavior. So,
mm.
so I think that, one of the things that's happened is you guys have a little bit more wiggle room to be what you are, which is a positive influence on a group of young people.
Oh, that's a really beautiful way to say that. Thank you. And what about reclaiming futures?
So we are in our 20th year, and we've evolved a lot too as the system has evolved. We started out kind of really bringing this idea that, as we talked about at the very beginning, that when a kid gets arrested, you ought to think about whether they have any need for treatment. Are they using substances? Do they need therapy and counseling? Have they been traumatized? And so the field has advanced enormously. They don't need Reclaiming Futures to tell them to ask those questions of kids at the point of arrest anymore. The field has sort of naturally done that. We certainly have played a role in that in changing the system. Other big initiatives have also done that. We have started to think and move a little upstream of youth justice, and we're doing a lot of work in schools. We're working on sort of building models in schools to transform the way that they handle discipline and behavior. When a kid's sort of the justice version of what happens in school. When a kid, does something that's an infraction of a school's behavior policy, what do you do? So to limit exclusionary discipline and suspending kids, and replace that with a kind of communal intervention where kids are welcomed back into the circle and literally sit in a circle with anyone they might have harmed. So we're trying to bring restorative practice into schools as an alternative to traditional disciplines, kinds of practices that really led to what a lot of people now refer to as the school to prison pipeline. A suspended kid or an expelled kid is significantly more likely to end up in the justice system and have poor life outcomes. So part of what we're trying to do is to short circuit that, but help schools build community and address climate. And we also bring our traditional public health perspective to that conversation too, and help schools to become more sensitive to when a kid is showing signs of needing support. So we kind of are
Wonderful.
building this unified model and testing it around the country. And so we're in schools now more than we are in justice settings, but we're also—
I'm thrilled by that. Manhattan Theater Club spends a lot of time in schools. Well, when we're not in COVID,
right.
in schools. And there's what you just said about, there are reasons, that kids get picked up if they're expelled and they're on the street. And then there are reasons that they're acting out. There's food insecurity. There's dyslexia that has not been diagnosed. There's so much, I'm so happy to hear that. I feel like we're, in our work with the theater and with Reclaiming Futures, we're coming together in this
I
beautiful
think so
way.
too, and I'm hoping, that the field is also coming full circle and acknowledging the importance, preventing, strengthening communities, granting communities a greater role in the care of young people, and to
Yes.
minimize the bureaucracy of juvenile justice as an alternative to community, which
That's great.
community is good enough. Maybe it's under
Community is
resourced.
community is absolutely good enough. I mean, think about, history when the community comes together and says, hey, that's really not happening. But what do you need? You need a cry, you need a shoulder, you need to tell your story. I mean, what we have that's similar to that, Evan, is our circle. We always meet in a circle, we check in, we deal with how we are. We whether that's in a metaphor, like, how are you in terms of weather? I am cloudy and I'm about to explode with a thunderstorm. And we get to work that out. And our community of the Stargate young men support each other. And that's what's so fascinating for me,
So
is that
powerful.
somehow with this sort of top-down justice that we, certainly we need justice. I'm not saying that,
Right. No one's saying that. Yeah.
but there are other ways to dispense justice,
Yeah, and with all the good intentions, back to your first question about building a family cord and this more of a milieu experience for a young person who gets arrested, with all the best intentions of justice to build these kind of proxy community elements, mentor programs, a judge who tries to engage in a more collegial and paternal way, and bringing families into court and all of the stuff, and hiring treatment providers, people with social work degrees as probation officers, the attempts to turn the youth justice system into a kind of proxy community is well-intentioned, but not the right strategy. The investment should be in the community itself, and the trust should be in the community itself,
Yeah.
rather than to try to rebuild it inside a courtroom.
I was surprised one day. I guess this is, we all get older. Some kids were, sort of acting out on the train. This is when we could ride the train. And I just went over to them and I said, why don't you behave like your grandmother is on this train? You would not behave like this if I were your grandmother. And I could be your grandmother. And they went, oh, okay.
Yeah,
And
can I
if
tell
I
you?
had not spoken up, they might have gotten arrested. They're just being loud young kids.
Right. And that intervention is okay. And I know in some communities, sending you packing off to your grandma for a week was the way it was done.
And gave parents a little reprieve too. Evan, you are so smart and you have such expertise. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I want to thank you for coming and be with us. And people out there, I hope everyone is going to join us and the Stargate Theater Sharon Sullivan Company production of The Divide, premiering on MTC's YouTube channel and our Facebook page on Thursday, September 10th at 7 p.m. The Divide. Thank you so much.